September 18th, 1944. The air inside the German command post near the frontier was heavy with a tension so sharp it could cut glass. Hasso von Manteuffel stood over a table, his eyes tracing the Lorraine fields with a predatory focus. For the first time in months, the map promised him a long, forgotten path to total, crushing victory. Manteuffel was 51. He wasn't a dreamer or a fanatic blinded by Nazi rhetoric. He was a pragmatist, a seasoned master of armored warfare who had survived the hell of Russia and the brutal heat of North Africa. He knew the Wehrmacht was bleeding to death on two fronts. He knew the end was coming. But on this specific morning, he believed he held a winning hand. Under his direct command was the 113th Panzer Brigade. This wasn't a collection of battered remnants or desperate conscripts. This was Hitler's new Fire Brigade, a force sent directly from the factories to the front line. The tanks were so new that the crews were still wiping factory grease off the optics, and some were still learning the turret controls. But it didn't matter. Not when you were sitting inside 58 brand new Panthers. The Panther was the apex predator of the Western Front, a mechanical nightmare that haunted every Allied tanker's sleep. Manteuffel did the math with a grandmaster's cold precision. The U.S. Sherman was a reliable workhorse, but in a head-to-head fight, it was a joke. The Sherman carried a standard 75mm gun that struggled to penetrate anything at distance. But the Panther? Its high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 cannon was an executioner's tool. It could penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman from 2,000 meters away. That is over a mile of standoff distance. Meanwhile, the Panther's 80mm sloped frontal armor was a masterclass in engineering. At range, American shells didn't penetrate. They bounced off the glacis plate like harmless ping-pong balls. It was a mathematical certainty. The Panther could kill the Sherman from distances where the American gun was literally ineffective. Manteuffel studied his fuel allocations with equal intensity. 600,000 liters of fuel had been secured. It was enough for 2 days of high-intensity, lightning-fast operations. 48 hours. That was all he needed to break Patton's back. His objective was tactically elegant. He would launch a surgical strike into the dangerously exposed right flank of General George Patton's Third Army. Patton was arrogant, overextended, and vulnerable. His supply lines were stretched thin across 400 kilometers of French territory. His armored spearheads were scattered across a 180-kilometer front. Manteuffel's plan was to concentrate all 58 of his Panthers into a single armored fist and punch directly through the American 4th Armored Division. He would cut off Patton's lead elements, isolate them, and destroy them in detail. It would create a strategic crisis so profound that the Americans would be forced to halt their entire Western advance. By every rule of 1940s military logic, this plan was a guaranteed success. The German tanks were superior. The numbers were concentrated. The element of surprise was absolute. The Americans had no idea a fresh Panzer Brigade was massing in the dark forests and rolling hills of Lorraine. But Manteuffel was making a calculation based on a reality that no longer existed. He believed a tank battle was decided by the thickness of steel and the caliber of a gun. He didn't know he was leading his elite fire brigade into a trap constructed from 3 things the German military mind simply could not comprehend: speed, mathematics, and an industrial machine that functioned like a biological organism. At 0730 hours on September 19th, the lead elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade began their approach march. The ground began to vibrate with the roar of 58 Maybach engines. But then, the environment itself betrayed them. A thick, suffocating white fog rolled across the fields like a sentient entity. Visibility plummeted to 50 yards, then 30, then 10. In a heartbeat, Manteuffel's greatest strategic advantage, the long-range lethality of the Panther, evaporated. The execution has begun. At 0730 hours on September 19, 1944, the 113th Panzer Brigade began its final, agonizing transition from a tactical plan on a map to a physical reality on the ground. The lead elements of the German column pushed forward into a wall of white silence so thick it felt like a living thing, a suffocating shroud that muffled the roar of 58 Maybach engines and turned the clanking of steel tracks into a ghostly, rhythmic thrum. Visibility, which Manteuffel had calculated at 2,000 meters, had plummeted to less than 30 yards. Inside the lead Panther, the commander stood hunched in his cupola, his periscope useless, his eyes stinging from the damp chill of the Lorraine mist. He was a predator designed for the open plains, a sniper of the steppes, now forced to hunt in a basement. 15 kilometers away, inside the American Combat Command A headquarters, the atmosphere was a stark contrast of clinical efficiency and rising adrenaline. Colonel Bruce Clark stood over his own maps, listening as the first frantic reports from forward observers filtered through the radio static. Heavy engine noise, large formations, moving west. Clark didn't have a brigade of heavy tanks to meet this threat. He didn't have the luxury of steel fortresses. What he had was the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by a man whose name was already becoming a legend among the armor crews, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams was a man who understood the geometry of violence. He didn't panic when he heard the sheer numbers of the German advance. Instead, he felt the cold, sharp clarity of a tactical opportunist. He stood in the damp air, chewing on an unlit cigar, and realized instantly that the environment had just handed him a catastrophic equalizer. "If they can't see us at 2,000 yards," Abrams grunted to his officers, "then their big guns aren't worth the steel they're cast from." He knew that the fog had just turned a modern tank battle into a knife fight in a phone booth, a theater of war where speed, reaction time, and raw aggression would outweigh gun caliber and armor thickness. Abrams ordered his units to displace, not to form a defensive line, but to become a swarm. The German column continued its rigid, disciplined advance through the mist, the tank commanders still believing they were the ones holding the initiative. They expected to encounter an American picket line, a thin screen of Shermans that they would crush under their tracks before breaking into the vulnerable rear areas. But as the lead Panther reached the outskirts of a small village, the silence of the fog was shattered by a sound like a thunderclap. The lead tank didn't just stop, it erupted. A high-velocity 76mm shell, fired from an invisible position in the mist, punched through the Panther's side armor with the ease of a hot needle through wax. The turret was thrown outward by an internal explosion, a geyser of sparks and white-hot metal illuminating the fog for a terrifying second. Then the second tank in the column was hit. Then the third. The German radio nets, usually a model of disciplined communication, collapsed into a cacophony of panicked voices. "Enemy to the left! No, enemy to the right! Where are they?" The German commanders, trained for coordinated maneuvers and mutual support, found themselves isolated in a white void. They swung their massive turrets left and right, desperately searching for a muzzle flash, for a silhouette, for anything to shoot at. But there was nothing but the gray wall of the fog and the screaming of metal. The shots were hitting them from the flanks, bypasses they thought were secure, punching through the thinner side armor that was only 40 millimeters thick. The 80mm glacis plate, the impenetrable shield Manteuffel had banked on, was useless because the enemy refused to stand in front of it. The reality of the situation was far more disturbing than a simple ambush. The 113th Panzer Brigade hadn't hit a wall of American heavy tanks. They had walked into a hive of M18 Hellcats. To a German tanker, the Hellcat was a mechanical joke, a piece of American engineering that defied every principle of survival. It had almost no armor. A heavy machine gun could penetrate its thin turret walls. It had an open top, leaving the crew exposed to the elements and the lethal rain of airburst shrapnel. By the standards of the Wehrmacht, which valued protection above all else, the Hellcat was an absurd suicide machine. But the M18 possessed one statistic that Manteuffel had completely omitted from his cold, mathematical calculations: power-to-weight ratio. The Hellcat weighed only 17 tons, less than half the weight of a Panther. Despite its featherweight frame, it was powered by a 9-cylinder Wright Continental radial aircraft engine, the same roaring powerhouse that drove American fighter planes through the sky. This technological marvel produced 350 horsepower,